The stagecoach lurched to a violent stop, and Eva Garrison slammed forward against the worn leather seat, her carpetbag tumbling to the floor of the coach with a dull thud. Outside, the driver was shouting something sharp and profane, and the horses were stamping and blowing, their iron shoes scraping the hard-packed earth of the dusty creek road. Eva pressed her face to the small window and felt her breath leave her body in one stunned rush. There was a man on horseback blocking the entire width of the road. Not just any man. Milton Sawyer. He sat his big bay gelding with the easy, infuriating confidence of someone who had never once in his 32 years been told no and believed it. His hat was pushed back just enough to show the hard line of his jaw, the 3 days of dark stubble, the eyes that were the pale, unsettling gray of a sky about to break open. His hands were loose on the reins. He was not reaching for a weapon. He did not need one. His mere presence was the weapon, broad-shouldered and immovable as the red bluffs behind him. "Mr. Sawyer, you move that horse or I will run you down," the driver bellowed from his box. "You won't," Milton said. His voice carried down through the coach roof, low and certain, and Eva felt it vibrate somewhere behind her sternum in a way that made her furious with herself. This stage doesn't roll until Eva Garrison gets out of that coach and says what she came here to say. The other 2 passengers, a portly land surveyor and an elderly woman in black bombazine, turned to look at Eva with wide, bewildered eyes. Eva straightened her spine. She smoothed the front of her traveling dress, a dusty burgundy wool that had seen better days, and she lifted her chin until her jaw ached with the effort of it. "There is nothing," she said loudly enough for him to hear through the thin coach wall, "that I wish to say to Milton Sawyer." "That," Milton replied, and she could hear the ghost of something in his voice, something that was not quite amusement but was its darker, more desperate cousin, "is not what your letter said." The word hit her like a thrown stone. The letter. The letter she had written at 2 o'clock in the morning 3 weeks ago, in a grief-soaked, sleepless fury, and had sent without thinking, and had regretted every single day since. The letter that contained the truth she had spent 11 months carefully hiding behind a wall of polite silence and dignified withdrawal. The letter that had said, in ink she could not take back, that she was in love with him. She had not known he would read it. She had addressed it to his ranch, yes, but she had written it for herself. A letter she needed to write the same way a wound needs to drain before it can heal. She had assumed his housekeeper, old Mrs. Prout, would set it on the desk with the rest of his correspondence, and that Milton, who was perpetually behind on his paperwork and kept a stack of unopened envelopes 3 inches high beside his inkwell, would never get to it before she was safely gone. She had assumed wrong. And now here she was, trapped inside a stagecoach on the dusty creek road in the summer of 1882, 2 miles from the town of Garrison Falls, New Mexico territory, with the man she loved blocking her escape route and demanding she speak the truth out loud. It had not always been this complicated. Eva Garrison had arrived in Garrison Falls in September of 1881, not as a stranger but as a returning native, which in some ways was worse. The town bore her family name, built on land her grandfather had settled in the 1850s, and her return after 7 years in Boston studying at the Holyoke Female Seminary was supposed to be triumphant. Instead, she arrived to find that her father, Judge Harland Garrison, was dying of a slow fever that had begun in June and was not letting go, and that the Garrison estate, which had once been the finest property in the territory, was in serious financial trouble. The trouble had a name: Cecil Aldridge. Cecil Aldridge was the man Harland Garrison had trusted with his accounts and his land deeds for 15 years. And Cecil Aldridge had, over the course of those 15 years, been quietly bleeding the estate dry through falsified records, inflated supply invoices, and 3 land deals that had transferred parcels of Garrison land to Aldridge-controlled companies for a fraction of their value. By the time Eva arrived and began going through the books with the systematic, educated eye her father had never bothered to apply, the damage was catastrophic. She had spent 2 weeks doing nothing but reading ledgers at the kitchen table, her father asleep upstairs, a lamp burning through the night while she cross-referenced figures and wrote careful notes in the margins. She was not emotional about it. She was precise. She had learned precision at Holyoke, had sharpened it against 7 years of academic rigor, and now she used it like a blade. What she found was a betrayal so thorough, so carefully constructed, so layered with hidden motive and deliberate deception, that it took her breath away in the same way that discovering a beautiful piece of music turned out to be a forgery might. The elegance of the crime was almost admirable. Almost. It was her father's foreman, a sun-cracked man named Pete Holloway, who told her she needed a lawyer. And it was Pete who told her that the best man in the territory for untangling land fraud was not a lawyer at all, but a rancher. Milton Sawyer, Pete said, spitting tobacco juice off the porch rail. Runs the Broken Spur spread about 8 miles east. Man's got a mind like a steel trap, and he knows land law better than most judges. His father was a surveyor, see. He grew up reading deeds and plat maps the way other kids read dime novels. Lost his own property to a swindle about 6 years back, got it all back through the courts, and then some. If anyone can read what Aldridge did and figure out how to unravel it, it's Milton. Eva had ridden to the Broken Spur the next morning on a borrowed horse because the Garrison horses had been sold to pay back taxes the previous spring. She had expected a rough man. The kind that Pete Holloway was, work-hardened and weather-beaten, useful and uncomplicated. What she found was someone who alarmed her immediately, not because he was dangerous, but because he was not what she had prepared for. Milton Sawyer was reading when she arrived, sitting at a scarred wooden desk in a room lined with bookshelves, and he looked up from his book with those pale gray eyes and waited for her to speak without a single trace of the performative male impatience she had learned to expect from men of property in this territory. She stated her business crisply. He asked 3 precise questions. Then he said, "Leave the ledgers. Come back Thursday." She had left the ledgers and come back Thursday, and by Thursday he had already identified 2 of the 3 fraudulent land transfers and had a preliminary legal strategy written out in a clean, clear hand that she read twice before she admitted to herself that it was genuinely brilliant. They worked together for 6 weeks. Every Thursday and often on other days besides, Eva would ride to the Broken Spur or Milton would ride to the Garrison estate, and they would sit across a table from each other and work through the documents with a shared, almost wordless focus that felt, to Eva, simultaneously professional and dangerously intimate. He never spoke to her as though she were ornamental. He never explained things she already understood. When she caught an error in his reasoning, he corrected himself without embarrassment. When he caught an error in hers, he pointed it out without condescension. She had not known that working with a man like this was possible. She did not know, for a long time, that she was falling in love with him. She told herself what she was feeling was professional respect. She told herself it was gratitude. She told herself later that it was simply the natural result of spending concentrated time with an intelligent person, and that it would pass. It did not pass. What happened instead was her father died. Harlan Garrison died on a cold November morning, 2 months after Eva's return, and he died knowing that the case against Aldridge was building, that the land might be recoverable, that his daughter was fighting for his legacy. Eva held his hand until it went still, and then she sat in the chair beside his bed for a long time without moving. She was 26 years old, and she was alone in a house that bore her family name and owed money to everyone in the county. Milton came to the funeral. He stood at the back of the church, hat in his hands, and he didn't speak to her until everyone else was gone, and then he said only, "I'm sorry, Miss Garrison. He was a good man." She had said, "Thank you, Mr. Sawyer." And there it was, that terrible formality they had maintained through all those weeks of close work, the glass wall she had built carefully between them, because she was a woman alone, and he was a man of property, and any suggestion of personal feeling would immediately undermine everything she was trying to accomplish. She could not afford to be seen as a woman pursuing a man. She could not afford to be anything but formidably competent. She had learned that lesson in Boston, where women who showed feeling were dismissed, and she applied it here with grim discipline. But the feeling was there. It had been there for a long time. It sat in her chest like a coal that would not cool, and every Thursday it burned a little hotter, and she banked it and covered it and pretended it was not there. Cecil Aldridge went on trial in February of 1882. The trial was the most dramatic event Garrison Falls had seen in a decade. Eva sat at the plaintiff's table every day, composed and implacable, presenting the evidence she and Milton had assembled with the precision of a surgeon. Aldridge had hired the best lawyer in Santa Fe. It did not help him. The evidence was too thorough, the documentation too complete. The jury was out for 4 hours and came back with a guilty verdict on all 3 counts of land fraud. The judge, a severe man from Albuquerque named Hutchins, ordered the fraudulent transfers reversed and the estate restored. It would take months to complete in the courts, he said, but the legal mechanism was set in motion. 2 of the 3 parcels came back immediately. The third, which Aldridge had already sold to a railroad company, would require a separate negotiation that Milton was already orchestrating. Eva should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt hollow because she realized, sitting in that courtroom as the verdict was read, that the work was almost done, and when the work was done, there would be no more Thursday meetings. There would be no more legitimate reason to sit across the table from Milton Sawyer and watch his mind work. She had let herself become dependent on something she had no right to. She resolved, in the way that she resolved everything, quietly and absolutely, to end it cleanly. She thanked Milton formally after the verdict, shook his hand, and told him she would send the final payment for his assistance the following week. He looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes in a way that she could not read and said, "The third parcel still needs attention, Miss Garrison. I have someone in Santa Fe who can handle the railroad negotiation," she said. This was a lie. She had no one in Santa Fe. He studied her for another moment. Then he said, "All right." She went home and spent 3 days managing the estate accounts and not allowing herself to think about those gray eyes. Then she hired a land agent in Santa Fe who was competent but not brilliant, and who cost twice as much as he was worth, and who would probably take 18 months to accomplish what Milton Sawyer would have done in 4. She told herself this was the rational choice. She told herself this, and she believed it, right up until the night 2 weeks later when she woke at 2 in the morning from a dream she could not remember but which had left her with tears drying on her face, and a sense of loss so acute it felt physical. She lit the lamp on the bedside table. She found paper and pen, and she wrote the letter. She wrote it as though no one would ever read it, which was both the most honest and the most catastrophic decision she had made in years. She wrote about watching him work. She wrote about the Thursday mornings when he would arrive already thinking, already 3 steps ahead of the problem, and how she had felt something lift in her chest every time she heard his horse come into the yard. She wrote about the way he had never once treated her intelligence as a curiosity or an inconvenience. She wrote about her father's death and her loneliness, which she had never admitted to anyone. She wrote about the coal in her chest, the one she had been banking for 6 months. She told him she was in love with him. She told him it was completely irrelevant because she was leaving, that she had accepted a position as a teacher and administrator at a school in Denver, that the estate would be leased to a tenant, that she would be gone before the summer ended. Then she folded the letter, addressed it to Milton Sawyer at the Broken Spur, and in some somnambulant state halfway between grief and recklessness, she put it in the mail. She woke the next morning with the clear, cold, terrible knowledge of what she had done. She spent 2 weeks convincing herself it was fine, that he would never read it, that Mrs. Prout would lose it or mistake it for something inconsequential. She threw herself into the preparations for leaving. She corresponded with the school in Denver. She arranged the lease. She packed her books and her father's photographs and her mother's china. She booked a seat on the stage to Santa Fe, from which she would connect to the rail line north. She was sitting in the Garrison Falls stage office, her trunk already loaded on the coach roof, her carpetbag in her lap, her face arranged in the expression of serene resolution she had been perfecting for months, when the door of the stage office opened and Pete Holloway stuck his head in. "There's a rider blocking the Dusty Creek Road," Pete said, with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral. "Who?" she asked, though something in her already knew. "Milton Sawyer," Pete said. "He's got his horse sideways across the whole road. Drivers hollering at him and he won't move. He's saying—" Pete paused, and Eva watched his face doing something complicated. "He's saying the stage doesn't leave until you get out and talk to him." She sat very still for a count of 10. Then she picked up her carpetbag, thanked Pete for the information, and boarded the stage without saying anything else, because if she opened her mouth fully she was not at all certain that the sound that would come out would be dignified. And now here she was, stopped on the Dusty Creek Road, with the land surveyor and the elderly woman in black bombazine watching her with the frank curiosity of people who have stumbled onto someone else's crisis and have no intention of pretending otherwise. "Miss," the elderly woman said, not unkindly, "it appears he is not going to move." "He will move," Eva said. "He does not appear to be moving." Outside, the driver was engaged in a colorful and escalating monologue that was producing no visible effect on either Milton or his horse. The bay gelding stood with all the serene immobility of a geographical feature. Eva counted to 10 again. Then she opened the coach door and stepped out onto the road. The July sun hit her like a physical force, the hard white light of New Mexico in midsummer, and she had to pause for half a second to let her eyes adjust. When they did, Milton was right there, 20 feet away, still on horseback, looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. It was not triumph. It was not the easy confidence she was used to reading in him. It was something stripped and urgent, almost frightened, and seeing it on his face frightened her in turn, because Milton Sawyer was not a man who showed fear. "You read my letter," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which she supposed was muscle memory at this point. "I read your letter," he said. "Then you know what it says and you know why I'm leaving, so I would appreciate it very much if you would move your horse and let this stage depart." "The letter says you're leaving because you think it doesn't matter," he said. "That's what you wrote, that it was irrelevant, that you were going anyway." "That is correct." "Why?" She stared at him. The driver had gone quiet above her, apparently deciding that whatever was happening was more interesting than his schedule. The land surveyor had also put his head out the window. The elderly woman in bombazine was watching from the other window with an expression of undisguised romantic hope. "Mr. Sawyer," Eva said carefully, "I am a woman of limited means in a territory where a woman alone has very narrow options. I have been offered a position in Denver that will allow me to be financially independent and professionally useful. The fact that I have developed an inappropriate and inconvenient attachment to someone in this town does not constitute a reason to sacrifice my future." "An inappropriate and inconvenient attachment," he repeated, and his voice was very quiet. "Yes. Is that all it is to you?" She looked up at him and felt the coal in her chest catch with a heat she had been managing for months, and the honest answer rose in her throat like a flood, and she thought about banking it and covering it and refusing it the way she had refused it 100 times. She thought about Boston and about Holyoke and about everything she had learned regarding the cost of being seen to feel things. And she thought about her father's hands going still in hers, about how quickly things ended. "About the letters you wrote at 2 in the morning because the truth couldn't be contained anymore." "No," she said. "It is not all it is." He swung down from the horse. The movement was quick and fluid, and then he was on the ground, 6 feet from her, and without the elevation of horseback he was simply a man, broad-shouldered and dark-eyed and looking at her with an expression that made her feel as though the road beneath her feet was not entirely solid. "I need you to hear something," he said. "Mr. Sawyer, Milton," he said. After 6 months of Thursday mornings and everything in those ledgers and everything in that letter, I think you can call me Milton." She swallowed. "Milton. I received your letter on a Monday. I read it 3 times. I spent Monday night and all of Tuesday trying to think of the logical, appropriate response, which in my opinion has always been the correct approach to difficult situations." He paused. "I failed. I could not think of a logical response because there is not one. So I am doing this instead, which I recognize is neither logical nor appropriate. But I have been thinking about what you wrote in that letter for 2 weeks, and I cannot let you leave without telling you that I have had that same coal in my chest since October." She stopped breathing for a moment. "October," she said. "The day you found the discrepancy in the Aldridge supply invoices. You were looking at the ledger and your face changed, and I watched you put it together, and I thought, this woman is extraordinary, and something happened that I could not stop." He looked at her with those stripped, honest gray eyes. "I did not tell you because you were grieving your father and fighting for your land, and I was not going to add my feelings to what you were already carrying. Then you thanked me formally and told me you had someone in Santa Fe who could handle the railroad matter, and I understood that you were closing a door, and I respected that because I respected you. You should have," she began. "Should have what Eva told you. You had built that wall so carefully. You are the most deliberately composed person I have ever known. I did not think." He stopped. "I thought I had read it wrong. I thought what I was feeling was mine alone. Then your letter came and I realized I had been looking at the same picture you had been looking at, and we had both been pretending it was something else." Eva looked at the road. She looked at the dust on her boots. She looked at the bluffs behind him, red and ancient and indifferent, and she thought about Denver, about the school and the contract and the careful, independent future she had constructed. She thought about how cold she had been in Boston, 7 years of being extremely capable and extremely alone. She looked back at Milton. "The position in Denver is a real position," she said. "I have signed a letter of intent. I know. I'm not the sort of woman who abandons commitments she has made. I know that too. What exactly are you proposing, Milton?" He was quiet for a moment in a way she recognized. The particular silence of a man who had already thought through the thing he was about to say and was choosing his words with care. It was the same silence he used when he was about to present a legal argument. "I am proposing," he said, "that you do not make a permanent decision based on the assumption that nothing here is worth staying for. I am proposing that you consider the possibility that what is between us is not inconvenient or irrelevant, but something worth examining seriously before you board a stage to Santa Fe." He paused. "I am proposing that if you still want to go to Denver after this conversation, I will move my horse and you will go, and I will not come after you. But I am not willing to let you leave without knowing that you had the choice." Behind Eva, the driver muttered something under his breath. The land surveyor withdrew his head from the window with the air of a man who had accidentally witnessed something sacred and felt embarrassed about it. The elderly woman in bombazine was smiling. Eva Garrison stood in the middle of the dusty creek road in the July heat of 1882 and felt the coal in her chest become something else entirely. Not a banked coal, not a controlled burn, something that had stopped being manageable and had become simply and irreducibly true. "I signed a letter of intent," she said again, but her voice was different now. "Write them another letter," Milton said quietly. "Tell them your circumstances have changed." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back, steady and unafraid and honest in the way that he always was, that quality in him that had first alarmed her and then captivated her and then become, she realized now, essential. "Your horse," she said, "is eating my hat." Milton glanced back. The bay gelding had in fact gotten into her carpetbag, which she had set down when she stepped out of the coach, and was nuzzling the ribboned bonnet that sat on top. "Hector," Milton said with mild reproach. The gelding ignored him completely. And Eva Garrison, who had spent 7 years learning how not to laugh in inappropriate moments, laughed. It came out of her suddenly and completely, and it sounded foreign to her own ears, lighter than she remembered herself being capable of, and Milton looked at her with those gray eyes, and something in his face shifted from that stripped urgency to something warmer, something that made the afternoon seem more bearable despite the heat. "All right," she said when the laughter had subsided into something quieter. "All right, I'll send the letter." He was very still. "You'll stay," he said. "I'll send the letter," she repeated, because she was not a woman who committed to things she hadn't fully thought through, and she needed a few more minutes to be certain. "And I will stay for dinner, and we will have a conversation that is not conducted in the middle of a public road, and then I will know whether I am staying." The driver above made a sound of theatrical exasperation. "Lady, the stage has a schedule." "Bill the extra time to me," Milton said, not looking up. "You can't bill a stagecoach company $2, Milton said, and reached into his vest pocket and produced $2 silver that he handed up to the driver without any particular ceremony. The driver pocketed the coins with a speed that put his theatrical exasperation in some question. "I'll need to retrieve my trunk from the coach roof," Eva said. "I'll get it," Milton said. "You most certainly will not. I am capable of arranging the retrieval of my own trunk, thank you." "I don't doubt it," he said, and stepped back to give her room, and she could see in his peripheral expression that he was extremely close to smiling. They retrieved her trunk. Milton tied it behind his saddle with a rope from his saddlebag, and Eva reclaimed her carpetbag and rescued what remained of her bonnet from Hector's interested nosing. And the stage rolled on without her, while the elderly woman in bombazine leaned out the window as it departed and called, "Good luck, dear," in a carrying voice that made several crows lift from a nearby juniper tree. They rode back toward Garrison Falls together, Eva on Hector because Milton insisted she take the horse and he walked beside, which annoyed her on principle, but was undeniably practical given that there was no second horse and her trunk needed carrying. The road was hard and pale under the afternoon sun, the bluffs painted in shades of red and orange to the east, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable but rather expectant, the kind of silence that has a shape. "How did you know what time the stage was leaving?" Eva asked. "Pete Holloway told me." She absorbed this. "Pete told you. He sent word Monday morning. Said you'd booked a seat for Thursday and that if I had something to say I'd better say it before Thursday noon." She was going to have a very pointed conversation with Pete Holloway. "Did everyone in this county know I was leaving except me?" "I think the general consensus among people who pay attention," Milton said carefully, "was that you were leaving and that it was a waste." "A waste," she repeated, not entirely pleasantly. "Of someone exceptional," he said, without inflection, as though he were stating a fact about the weather or the price of cattle, and the matter-of-fact quality of it was somehow more devastating than any amount of romantic rhetoric would have been. She looked at the road ahead and said nothing for a long while. They reached the Garrison estate in the late afternoon. It was the first time Milton had been here since November, since the funeral, and Eva watched him look at it as they came up the drive. The white house with its deep porch, the oak tree in the yard, the fields beyond lying fallow in the summer heat. The estate was diminished from what it had been, the fences needing work, the garden unpruned, but it was intact and it was hers, recovered from Aldridge's hidden motive and systematic theft through sheer force of documentation and determination. "It's a good property," Milton said. "Yes," she said. "It is." She made coffee. She was not a spectacular cook, but she made good coffee, and she put it on the table in the front room with the cups her mother had brought from Missouri in 1858, blue willowware with a fine crack in one saucer that her mother had always meant to replace and never had. Milton sat across the table from her in the chair he had occupied every Thursday for 6 weeks, and for a moment it was like those mornings again, except the ledgers were gone and there was no pretending. "Tell me about the school in Denver," he said. She looked at him. "Why?" "Because it matters to you. Because the reason you applied matters. Because understanding what you want is not something I'm willing to skip past." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. The school is the Holyoke Extension, a women's academy essentially. They want someone to teach literature and history and to help develop a curriculum that takes women seriously as students, not as decorative accomplishments. She paused. It is exactly the kind of work I would find meaningful. Yes, he said, I can see that. There is nothing comparable in Garrison Falls. No, he agreed. There isn't. So you understand why I understand, he said. I'm not asking you to give it up for nothing, Eva. I would never ask that. He turned his coffee cup between his hands, the gesture of a man thinking carefully. What I want you to consider is whether the work you do there is the only work you find meaningful. She frowned. What do you mean? You've been managing this estate. You've been fighting a land fraud case. You've been doing the work of 3 people since September and doing it well. You're capable of things this territory needs badly and doesn't have. He looked at her steadily. There are children in this county who attend a school that I would not send livestock to. There is no library within 40 miles. There is no one addressing any of these things because no one here has the education or the will to do it. She was quiet. I'm not saying that's your obligation, he said quickly. I'm not saying you owe this place anything. You already saved the estate. I'm saying if you're looking for meaningful work, there is meaningful work here, and it would be yours to shape. She looked at the crack in the saucer of her mother's cup. She thought about her grandmother, who had come to this territory in a wagon and built something from nothing, and her grandfather, who had surveyed land and laid out the town that bore the family name. She thought about what that name was worth, and what it could still mean, and what she had come back to find and had, against considerable odds, recovered. You are making a very organized argument, she said. I have a naturally organized mind, he said, and this time the ghost of something in his voice was fully a smile, and she felt it through the table like a warm current. I notice, she said, that you have addressed my career and my purpose, but you have not said anything further about your own feelings since we left the road. He met her eyes. I said what needed saying on the road. I'm not going to press you. That's not something I'm willing to do. Some women might find that exasperating, she said. Are you exasperated? She thought about it. No, she admitted. I find it distinctly characteristic of you and therefore, she paused, choosing her word, reassuring. Something shifted in the air between them. Milton set down his coffee cup. He did not stand or move around the table. He simply looked at her with that quality of complete attention she had first encountered in October and had been unable to forget since, and said, "What do you want, Eva?" No one had asked her that in a very long time. Not since her father, and even he had asked it abstractly, in the theoretical way of a man who loved his daughter but had assumed her wants were manageable and secondary to the larger requirements of the estate and the family. She had been in Boston being shaped into a useful woman. She had been here fighting for her inheritance. She had been moving forward with the disciplined purposefulness of someone who had long since decided that wanting things was a luxury she could not afford. I want, she said slowly, as though testing each word before she committed to it, to stay here. He was very still. I want to stay here, she said again, more firmly, and I want to do something useful with what I know and what I have, and I want, she stopped. And, he said quietly. She looked at him across the table, across the cups with the blue willowware pattern and the cracked saucer, across the space that had always felt both professional and charged, and she said, I want to stop pretending that what I feel when I am in this room with you is professional respect. He was around the table before she had finished the sentence. Not impulsively, not rashly, but with the same deliberate, considered motion he applied to everything, as though he had thought about this moment and decided precisely what he would do when it came. He stood beside her chair and offered her his hand, and she took it, and he drew her up to standing, and they were very close together in the front room of the Garrison estate in the evening light that came through the west window, and he looked at her the way she had not let herself imagine. I am a straightforward man, he said. I have no dark secrets or hidden motives. I have a functioning ranch, some debts, one horse with the manners of a goat, and a serious attachment to you that I have been managing badly for 6 months. That's the whole of it. That," she said, "is genuinely a relief." He kissed her, carefully and then less carefully, and it was not like anything she had managed to theorize about it during those months of disciplined suppression. It was warmer and more specific, the way real things always are more specific than imagined things. She wrote the letter to Denver the next morning. She sat at her father's desk, and she wrote it clearly and without apology, explaining that her circumstances had changed, that she was remaining in New Mexico territory, and that she hoped they would find an equally suitable candidate for the position. She sealed it and addressed it and walked it to the post office herself. Then she went to the Broken Spur and told Milton she had sent it. He was sitting at his desk reading when she arrived, which was exactly as she had first found him, and he looked up with those gray eyes and said, "Good." And then he came around the desk, and there was another of those deliberate, considered moments that were becoming, she realized, one of her favorite things about him. The weeks that followed were the strangest and most unexpected of Eva's recent experience, in that they were happy. She had not permitted herself happiness as a primary state for so long that she had forgotten its texture. It felt almost suspicious, like a clear sky before a storm, and she kept waiting for the catastrophe. What arrived instead of catastrophe was the third parcel. The railroad negotiation, which the Santa Fe land agent had been managing with all the effectiveness of a damp match, came to a sudden crisis in late August when the railroad company announced it intended to accelerate its construction timeline and would need to begin grading the disputed parcel in 60 days. The land agent sent Eva a panicked letter. Eva read it twice, set it down, and rode to the Broken Spur. Milton read the letter standing up. He handed it back to her, went to his shelf, pulled down a volume of territorial land law, and turned to a specific page with the ease of someone who knew exactly where everything was. "They cannot begin grading if there's an active legal dispute over clear title," he said. "Here, the territorial statute is unambiguous. My agent in Santa Fe apparently missed that." "Your agent in Santa Fe is extremely expensive and not very good," Milton said, which was more candid than diplomatic but also accurate. "What do I do?" "You let me file a temporary injunction in the territorial court," he said, "and you fire the man in Santa Fe." She looked at him. "This is not your case anymore." "You can pay me," he said, and there was something in his voice that was almost sardonic, except gentler than sarcasm, the quality of a man who is trying to give a stubborn, independent woman a face-saving path to accepting help. "What do you charge?" she said, matching his tone. "Dinner," he said, "every Sunday." She considered this. "That is an extremely low rate." "I'm not doing it for the rate," he said simply. He filed the injunction. The railroad's lawyers came down from Denver, and they were formidable and expensively dressed, and Milton Sawyer met them in the Garrison Falls courthouse in a suit that had seen better days, and with a knowledge of territorial land law that was so thorough and so precisely applied that one of the railroad lawyers, a heavyset man from Chicago named Carr, took Milton aside after the first hearing and asked him where he had studied law. "I didn't," Milton said. "I read." The injunction held. The railroad was forced to negotiate. The third parcel was eventually purchased back by the Garrison estate at a fair market price that the railroad paid, with the simmering reluctance of an organization that had expected an easy acquisition and gotten something else entirely. Eva received the deed on a Friday afternoon in September, exactly 1 year after her return to Garrison Falls. She sat at her father's desk and held it for a long time, the paper heavy and formal in her hands, and she thought about Harlan Garrison, who had trusted the wrong man and had died before he could see the wrong undone. She went to the cemetery after she left the courthouse. It was a quiet place at the edge of town, the grave shaded by a single large cottonwood, and she stood at her father's headstone for a while without saying anything. Then she said, "We got it back, Papa, all of it." She folded the deed and put it in her coat pocket and walked back to the main street. Milton was waiting outside the courthouse with his horse, which suggested Pete Holloway had been communicating again. She had stopped trying to discourage Pete Holloway from this activity. "All 3 parcels," she said. "All 3, he agreed. She looked at the main street of Garrison Falls, the dry goods store and the land office and the small, inadequate schoolhouse at the far end where she had been, for the past 6 weeks, spending 3 mornings a week tutoring the teacher, a young man newly arrived from Ohio named Chambers who was enthusiastic and underprepared. She had not meant to do it. She had gone to look at the schoolhouse purely out of the professional assessment habit she couldn't seem to stop applying to everything, and she had found Chambers overwhelmed and had begun, as she always did, by trying to help. "I want to talk to you about the school," she said. "I thought you might," Milton said. They walked, leading Hector between them, and Eva told him what she had been thinking since August, about the schoolhouse and its deficiencies and what could be done about them, about a library that she was beginning to believe she could fund through a combination of her own resources, and the town council if she approached the council correctly, about a curriculum that did not treat the girls in the class as temporary students waiting to grow up into wives. Milton listened with the totality of attention she had come to rely on. "You'll need money for the library," he said. "I have some. The railroad payment gives me more. And for an additional teacher's position." "Yes. I was thinking about approaching the town council in October." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Marry me." She stopped walking. Hector stopped too, pressed his nose against Eva's shoulder in a gesture of equine solidarity that she would have appreciated more if she weren't currently short-circuiting. "That was not a logical progression from the library discussion," she said. "It's a separate point," he said. "I've been thinking about it for a while." She turned to look at him. He was facing her with that quality of complete, undefended honesty that she had come to understand was simply how he was. No performance, no strategy, just Milton Sawyer standing in the September afternoon telling her the truth. "I am not a conventional proposal," she said. "I intend to run a school. I intend to be professionally active. I will not be managing your household full-time. I have opinions about everything, and I am not inclined toward deference as a matter of principle." "I know," he said. "I am also deeply stubborn, also known to me, and you want to marry me anyway. Because of those things," he said, "not in spite of them." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the distance between October and September, about the Thursdays and the ledgers and the courthouse and the stagecoach road, and all the miles of this year she had spent in the company of someone who had never once treated her as a problem to be managed or a sentiment to be indulged. "Yes," she said. He blinked. "Yes. Yes, I will marry you," she said. You could look slightly more prepared for a positive answer. "I prepared for several possible answers," he admitted. "I ranked them by probability. Yes was not the top-ranked outcome." "What was?" "Something involving the word however," he said. She laughed, and he reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face with a careful hand, and Hector tried to eat her hat again. They were married in October of 1882, in the Garrison Falls church on a bright cold morning with a sky so deeply blue it looked painted. Pete Holloway, who had effectively orchestrated the whole thing by alerting Milton to the stage departure, stood in the front pew with the expression of a man who considers himself personally responsible for a satisfactory outcome. The ceremony was small. Eva had no family left except a distant cousin in Kansas she had not seen in 12 years. Milton had a sister in Tucson, Margaret, who could not make the journey on short notice, but who sent a long and warm letter, and a piece of Tucson lace that Eva wore at her collar. The wedding party was Garrison Falls, the town that bore her family name, the people who had watched her fight for her father's land and win, and they came in numbers that filled the small church to capacity. They moved to the Broken Spur, because the Broken Spur was the larger property, and because Eva's estate was now fully leased to a family named Harrington who were good tenants and paid on time and were grateful for the opportunity. Eva brought her mother's blue willowware and her father's books and the photograph of her parents from the hall. She set up a study in the room next to Milton's, which had been used for storage, and she spent the first week of her marriage rearranging it to her satisfaction, while Milton watched from the doorway with the expression of a man who is genuinely pleased to see his space being inhabited. "You're going to need more shelves," he said. "Considerably more shelves," she agreed. "And better light." The shelves arrived by November, built by a carpenter in town named Hennessy, who was grateful for the business. The light was addressed by moving the desk to face the east window, which Milton did without being asked, appearing one evening with the desk already in the new position while Eva was at the schoolhouse. The schoolhouse was, by November, a different place than it had been in August. Eva had gone to the town council in October, the week after the wedding, and had made a case for funding that was so thoroughly documented and carefully argued that the council, 4 men who had expected to say no to a woman's request as a matter of principle, found themselves saying yes before they had quite understood how they had arrived at that position. She had the money for a second teacher position. She had a modest budget for books. She wrote to Holyoke. She wrote to contacts in Santa Fe. She wrote to the territorial school board, which was largely ineffectual but could occasionally be made useful by the application of sufficiently organized correspondence. By December, a second teacher had arrived, a woman from Pennsylvania named Clara Holt, who was 24 and sharp-minded and grateful for the work, and who became, within weeks, Eva's closest friend in Garrison Falls. The library was a project for the following spring. Eva had already identified the building, a former land office at the end of Main Street that its owner, a man named Fitch, would lease at a reasonable rate. She had already begun the process of soliciting book donations from individuals in the territory, writing letters with the focused efficiency of someone who had been writing persuasive correspondence her entire adult life. Milton read her drafts when she asked him to, which was not always, because she was not in the habit of asking for approval and did not intend to start. But sometimes she wanted another precise mind looking at her language, and his was the one she trusted most, and he would read quietly and occasionally make a small suggestion that was almost always correct, and she would accept it or not based on her own assessment, and he never showed any sign of minding either way. This was, she reflected during one of those evenings, the thing she had not known was possible. Not the practical arrangements of a marriage, not the management of shared property and resources, but this specific texture of being with someone who was neither diminished by her capabilities nor performing indifference to them. She had been told in Boston, by a well-meaning professor who ought to have known better, that very capable women often found marriage difficult because men required a certain amount of intellectual superiority to remain comfortable. She had filed this away as probable and had conducted herself accordingly, expecting that any intimate arrangement would require her to be less. It had not occurred to her that the solution was simply to find a man who was secure enough in himself that her being fully herself was not a threat but a pleasure. She was aware that this made her fortunate in a way that most women of her time were not, and she did not take it lightly. She thought about Clara Holt, who was brilliant and unmarried and navigating Garrison Falls with the wariness of someone who had already learned what happens when women show too much. She thought about the girls in the schoolhouse. She thought about the library, which would be open to everyone, which would be a place where a girl could read without anyone telling her what was appropriate. These thoughts kept her at her desk past midnight on more occasions than was strictly healthy. Milton would find her there when he woke at 2 or 3 in the morning for water, the lamp burning, her pen moving, and he never told her to come to bed in the tone of a man asserting his conjugal priority. He would bring her a cup of water and set it on the edge of the desk, and look at what she was writing and sometimes ask a question and sometimes not, and go back to bed, and she would follow eventually when she was ready. She loved him for that. She loved him for many things, and she had stopped being startled by the depth and specificity of the feeling. It was not the vague, glittering romance she had read about in novels, which had always seemed to her aesthetically pleasing and practically questionable. It was particular and grounded, rooted in the specific quality of this man who read widely and spoke precisely, and stood his horse across a road when the thing that mattered was in danger of disappearing. She told him so, one evening in January, sitting by the fire while the wind came down from the north and tested the windows. She said, "I want you to know that I understand what you did on that road. What it cost you in terms of risk." He looked up from his book. "You could not have known I would get out of that coach," she said. "You could not have known I wouldn't simply stay inside and tell the driver to go around." "There was no going around," he said. "The road is narrow there, the bluffs on the east side and the drop on the west. You chose that spot deliberately." "I know that road well," he said. She looked at him with affection that she no longer bothered to moderate. "You were terrified." "I was," he said without hesitation or embarrassment. "And you did it anyway. Some things," he said, "are worth being terrified for." She got up from her chair and went and sat beside him on the worn sofa, which was a piece of furniture she had been intending to replace, but had stopped wanting to replace because it was the right kind of worn, broken in and comfortable, like everything at the Broken Spur that had been honestly used. He put his arm around her and she leaned into the solid warmth of him, and outside the wind was fierce and the fire was good, and the territorial night was long and quiet. She was pregnant by February, which was not entirely a surprise given the general domestic situation, but was still a fact that required some sitting with. She told Milton at breakfast on a Tuesday because that was when she was certain and because she did not know of any logical reason to delay the information. He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "How do you feel?" "Physically, I feel nauseated at intermittent intervals," she said. "Emotionally, I feel a complicated mixture of profound joy and significant anxiety about the logistics." "The logistics are manageable," he said. "I know they are," she said. "I am not worried about the logistics. I am worried about the school." He looked at her. "I am not going to stop," she said. "I want you to understand that. I am not going to retire to the house and become purely domestic. I understand that this is not what many wives do, and I want to be clear." "I didn't expect you to stop," he said. "Clara Holt is there. You'll adjust the schedule as needed. You'll know what you need." She looked at him across the breakfast table. "You are a very unusual man," she said. "You have mentioned that before," he said. "I mean it every time," she said. He smiled, and it was the smile she had come to know, not wide or showy but warm in the specific, directed way of a man who was smiling for her and not for any audience. "I know," he said. Their son was born in October of 1883, exactly 1 year after their wedding, which was a coincidence of timing that Pete Holloway declared was poetic and Eva declared was anatomically unremarkable. They named him Harlan James Sawyer, Harlan for her father and James for Milton's grandfather, who had surveyed the first roads of the territory before Milton's father had taken up the trade. Harlan James was a red-faced, opinionated infant who demonstrated from his first hours that he had inherited at least one parent's stubbornness in full measure. Eva nursed him and studied him with the same focused analytical attention she applied to everything, and found herself unexpectedly moved by the specificity of him, his small, demanding aliveness. She took 6 weeks at the Broken Spur before she went back to the school, because 6 weeks was what her body required, and she was not the kind of person who argued with factual physical requirements. Clara Holt managed without her and managed well, which Eva had expected, and which still gave her enormous satisfaction to see. The library opened in April of 1884. It was the thing Eva was most proud of, in a life that by that spring contained a great deal she was proud of. It was housed in the former Fitch Land Office, now repainted and repaired, with shelves along all 4 walls and a reading table down the center and 600 books, donated and purchased, that covered everything from territorial law to natural history, to poetry to the novels that the town council had initially suggested might be inappropriate for certain readers. A suggestion Eva had addressed with a 15-minute presentation, so exhaustively documented that the council had retracted the suggestion before she had finished the third page. The opening day brought 100 people, which was 1/5 of Garrison Falls's entire population, and among them were 17 children who had never been inside a room with that many books. Eva watched a girl of about 8, dark-haired and solemn, stand in the center of the library and turn slowly all the way around, looking at the shelves, and the look on the girl's face was something Eva kept with her for the rest of her life. Milton was there. He stood at the back of the room in his good suit, which had received a respectable update since the railroad lawyers had impugned it, and he watched Eva speak to the gathered crowd with the same focused attention he had given her ledgers in October of 1881. And when she caught his eye across the room, there was something in his expression that was not pride exactly, because pride implies ownership and he was not that kind of man, but admiration, clear and complete, for what she had built. She caught his eye and then she went back to talking, because there were people to thank and remarks to make, but she carried that look with her like the warmth of a fire. Cecil Aldridge was released from the territorial prison in July of 1884, having served 18 months of a 3-year sentence, released for reasons that Eva considered a miscarriage of justice, and which she said so, in writing, to the territorial governor, the attorney general, and the editor of the Santa Fe newspaper. The letters were printed. There was some public debate. The Territorial Parole Board sent her a bureaucratic reply that she found insufficient and said so in a follow-up letter. Aldridge did not return to Garrison Falls. He was a diminished man by the reports she received, living in Albuquerque under a different name and working in a merchant's supply house. Eva monitored this situation with the detached attention of someone who has won a fight and wants to ensure it stays won. And then she went back to the library and the school and the life she was building, because Aldridge was a closed chapter, and she had no interest in dwelling in closed chapters. Pete Holloway retired from the Garrison estate in the fall of 1884, his knees giving him trouble after 40 years of working livestock, and Eva arranged a pension that she paid from the estate income, because Pete Holloway had worked for her family for a long time and had, at a crucial moment, sent the right information to the right man. She visited him on Sundays when she could, and he told her stories about her father as a young man that she had never heard, and she wrote some of them down. Their second child arrived in the spring of 1885, a daughter this time, which Eva noted with a calm certainty she had felt for 3 months, and which Milton regarded with the particular mixture of competence and terror that she had observed in him at Harlan's arrival, and which she found, despite herself, endearing. They named her Margaret Ruth, for Milton's sister in Tucson and for Eva's mother. Margaret Ruth was different from her brother in the way that people are simply different, quieter and more observational, with Milton's gray eyes and Eva's precision of movement. She was an infant who seemed to be studying her surroundings with a focused assessment that Eva recognized immediately. Milton's sister, Margaret, came from Tucson to see the new baby, staying 3 weeks, and Eva liked her with the clean, immediate certainty she had liked very few people. Margaret Sawyer was 34, unmarried, managing a schoolhouse in Tucson that was as underfunded as the Garrison Falls school had been when Eva arrived, and the two women spent long evenings at the Broken Spur kitchen table talking about education and territory politics, and the specific challenges of being a woman who intends to be taken seriously. Milton listened from his armchair by the fire and read his book, and occasionally contributed a remark that was so precisely relevant it startled both women into considering it seriously before continuing their argument. And Eva observed that her husband's ability to inhabit a room without dominating it was one of those qualities she had been unaware she was looking for until she found it. "You got very lucky," Margaret said to her brother, not unkindly, one evening when Eva had gone upstairs to check on the children. "I know it," Milton said. "So did she," Margaret said. "I know that too," he said, which Margaret told Eva later when they were saying goodbye on the morning of her departure. "He knows it," she said. "He said so." "He generally says what he knows," Eva said. "It's one of his more distinctive qualities." Margaret laughed and embraced her and made her promise to write, which Eva did faithfully because correspondence was one of her native arts and because Margaret was exactly the kind of person she wanted to keep in her life. The Broken Spur prospered through the late 1880s in the way that well-managed ranches prosper, not spectacularly but steadily, which was the more durable form of prosperity. Milton was a careful rancher, methodical and attentive to the land in the way that his father's surveying background had perhaps instilled, and the cattle were healthy, and the water was managed, and the fences were maintained. And Eva contributed to the operation not in the way of a decorative landowner's wife, but in the way of a second sharp mind with access to good financial records and strong opinions about which corners were worth cutting and which were not. She also ran the school and the library, and by 1887, a modest reading group that met on Wednesday evenings in the library's back room and that contained, by its second year, 22 women and 5 men who were not embarrassed to be seen reading in public. Harland was 4 when he started appearing at the library in the afternoons to sit under the reading table with a picture book and a proprietary air that Eva recognized as familial. He could not yet read, but he had opinions about which books were interesting based on their covers, which, she told Milton, was a fairly sophisticated initial assessment strategy. "He's going to be opinionated," Milton said. "He already is," Eva said. "I wonder where he gets it," Milton said, with the gray-eyed, deliberately straight-faced quality that she had come to understand was his version of comedy. "From you, obviously," she said. "You blocked a road." "Once," he said. "Once was sufficient," she said. She kissed him in the front room of the Broken Spur, with the evening light coming through the same west window it had come through when she had first agreed to write the letter to Denver. And outside Harland was shouting something at Hector, who was still alive and still attempting to eat hats with the committed enthusiasm of an animal that has found his calling. And inside it was warm and specific and real, the way she had stopped being afraid of things being. In 1888, the territorial legislature passed a law regarding women's property rights that Eva had been following with intense professional interest and occasional written contributions to the legislative debate. The law was imperfect, as most laws produced by the territorial legislature were, but it was substantially better than what had preceded it, and Eva wrote to 3 women she knew who were in situations analogous to the one she had been in 1881. With fathers or husbands whose property was vulnerable to exactly the kind of fraud Aldrich had committed, and she told them what she knew and pointed them toward what help was available. 2 of them wrote back. One of them was a woman in Lincoln County named Hayes, who had been dealing with a fraudulent land contract for 4 years, and who, following Eva's correspondence, found her way to a lawyer in Albuquerque, who resolved the matter in 6 months. Eva received a letter of gratitude from Mrs. Hayes that she kept in the middle drawer of her desk, which was where she kept the things she wanted to see regularly. In 1889, New Mexico Territory was still working toward statehood, which would not come until 1912, but the territory was changing in ways that Eva watched with the attentive interest of someone who had staked her life and her future in its soil. The railroad was spreading, connecting Garrison Falls to Santa Fe and Santa Fe to everywhere else, and the town was growing, new buildings going up at the west end, new families arriving, the population doubling toward the end of the decade. The school expanded. Eva oversaw the construction of a new building in 1890, a proper schoolhouse with 4 rooms and large windows, and a porch that the children used in fine weather for lessons. The building was funded partly through the county, partly through private donation, and partly through a benefit subscription drive that Eva organized with Clara Holt, who had been in Garrison Falls for 8 years now, and who was a fixture of the place in her own right. Clara had also, in the course of those years, married. Her husband was a man named Fowler who ran a printing operation in town, and who was, in Eva's assessment, precisely the right kind of man for Clara. Quiet enough to give her room and smart enough to appreciate what was in that room. The Fowlers had 2 daughters who attended the new schoolhouse, and Clara taught there 3 mornings a week and managed the curriculum with Eva the rest of the time. The Garrison Falls Library by 1890 had 1,500 books. Eva stood in it one Saturday afternoon and counted, the way she counted things, carefully and completely, and she had been counting since she was a child, and her father had let her count the cattle in the east pasture and enter the number in the livestock ledger in her childish, earnest handwriting, and the counting still gave her the same satisfaction, the satisfaction of knowing precisely what was there. 1,500 books in a town that had had none 8 years ago. She was 35 years old. She had been married for 8 years to a man who had once blocked a road rather than let her leave without hearing the truth, and who had never, in 8 years, given her reason to regret stepping out of that stagecoach. She was thinking these things in the library on a Saturday afternoon when the bell above the door rang and Milton came in, which was unusual because he was supposed to be supervising the mending of the north fence, and Milton was not a man who abandoned a task midway through without reason. He was carrying something. She looked at it. A letter from the envelope shape folded into his left hand. "What is it?" she said, because his expression was the one she associated with significant news. "Letter from Margaret," he said. "She's coming to Garrison Falls. For a visit, permanently," he said. "The Tucson school has closed, budget raisins, apparently. She's at loose ends and she's asking if there's work here." Eva looked at him. She looked at the shelves, at the 1,500 books, at the new schoolhouse she could see through the front window of the library, at the town that her family had named, and that she had returned to and stayed in and made into a different place than she had found it. "Tell her," Eva said, "to come as soon as she can get here. I've been wanting a second library director for 2 years." Milton read the letter through once more, and then he folded it and put it in his coat pocket and looked at her with those gray eyes that she had read wrong for months before she had understood how to read them, and that she had been reading correctly for 8 years since. "She'll be glad," he said. "So will I," Eva said. He crossed the library to where she was standing beside the fiction shelf, and he did not say anything else because there was nothing that needed saying. And she leaned into him in the way she had been leaning into him for 8 years without it becoming ordinary, because it was still always the same specific warmth of this particular man. And she thought about the dusty creek road and the July heat and the horse eating her hat, and about the letter she had written at 2 in the morning that she had intended no one to read. "I'm glad you read that letter," she said. He rested his chin against her hair. "I read every letter," he said. "You know that. The stack on your desk suggests otherwise." "Your letter came on top," he said. "I had a feeling about it." She tipped her head back to look at him. "A feeling." "A feeling," he said, steadily and without apology. She had thought when she first met him that he was purely a man of logic. She had thought his value was in his precision, his organized mind, his ability to read a document and find the truth in it. She had not initially understood that the precision and the feeling were the same thing in him, that the quality that made him able to find a hidden lie in a ledger was the same quality that made him certain, with the conviction of a man who trusts his own reading of things, that the letter sitting on top of the pile on a Monday morning was the one that could not wait. The afternoon light came through the library windows and lay in warm rectangles across the floorboards, and outside Garrison Falls went about its Saturday business. And inside the library that Eva Garrison Sawyer had built, she stood with the husband who had once blocked a road in the name of an inconvenient truth, and thought that some of the best decisions of her life had been made in inconvenient moments, when the logical choice had turned out to be the wrong one. Margaret Sawyer arrived in Garrison Falls in October of 1890 on the stage from Santa Fe, and Eva was at the stage office to meet her, because she still remembered, with a clarity that she suspected would never fully fade, what it felt like to step off a stage in Garrison Falls and find the world different from what she expected. Margaret stepped down from the coach with 2 trunks and the practical, slightly travel-worn air of someone who has covered a significant distance and is not going to make a fuss about it, and she took one look at the library building and said, "Is that it?" "That's the library," Eva said. "It's smaller than I expected," Margaret said. "We're expanding it," Eva said. "That's partly why I need you." Margaret looked at her with the Sawyer gray eyes, which were on her face too, same quality of looking that saw exactly what it looked at and did not pretend otherwise. "Show me the books," she said. Eva showed her the books. They spent 3 hours in the library that first afternoon, and Margaret had opinions about the cataloging system, and 2 specific suggestions for the fiction acquisition list, and 1 blunt question about why the history shelf was lighter on women than the mathematics shelf. To which Eva said, "We are working on that." And Margaret said, "Good." And that was the beginning of a professional partnership that was also a genuine friendship, rooted in the same directness and the same convictions. The library expanded in 1891. A new wing added to the back of the building, 12 more shelves, a small reading room with 3 comfortable chairs that were Eva's particular satisfaction, because she had been in too many libraries where comfort was considered inappropriate to the serious business of reading. Harland, 8 years old by then, could read anything in the children's section, and had begun on the adults, with the focused, selective speed of a reader who knows exactly what he's after. He had Milton's quality of being entirely comfortable with silence and Eva's quality of finishing things he started. And he had already informed both of them that he intended to be a surveyor when he grew up, which Eva suspected was his grandfather's influence reaching down through the family stories, Milton told in the evenings when the children were supposed to be going to sleep, but were instead listening from the stairs. Margaret Ruth was 6 and precise, and had decided that the natural world was more interesting than anything adults were doing, and she spent a significant amount of time in the East Pasture, studying the behavior of insects with a seriousness that Eva recognized and did not discourage. She had found 3 books on entomology in the library that she read repeatedly, and Eva had written to a professor in Albuquerque for additional titles. They were interesting children, both of them, in the way that children raised with books and wide spaces and parents who take ideas seriously tend to be interesting. They argued at dinner. They asked questions that required actual answers. They were, Eva thought, going to be fine. She thought this one winter evening in 1891, sitting at the dinner table in the broken spur kitchen with the fire going, and the cold outside and Harland explaining to Margaret Ruth with complete seriousness why a particular beetle she had found could not possibly be what she thought it was, which provoked a response from Margaret Ruth that suggested she had a future in litigation if the natural world didn't work out. Milton was eating his dinner and listening with the quality of attention he gave to things worth attending to, and he caught Eva's eye across the table, and the look between them was the one that had no language, the one that was simply the shared recognition of what they had built and how very unlikely it had been and how glad they both were. Later, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet and the fire had settled to coals, Milton sat beside her on the worn sofa, which had not been replaced and would not be replaced now because it was a fixture of the place the way some things become fixtures, and Eva leaned her head against his shoulder and thought about a letter written at 2 in the morning, and a road blocked on a July afternoon, and how some things that look like endings are really something else entirely. "Tell me something," she said. "What sort of something?" he said. "Anything," she said. "Tell me something I don't know." He was quiet for a moment, thinking, which was what he always did before he spoke on matters that deserved consideration. "The ranch to the north," he said, Old Brennan's place he's selling in the spring. I've been thinking about whether it's the right moment to take on the additional acreage." She lifted her head and looked at him. "How much acreage?" "About 400. Water rights, partial. The creek runs through the north corner." She sat up properly. He was watching her think, the way he had always watched her think, with that quality of genuine interest that had alarmed her the first time she experienced it, and had been one of the great pleasures of her life ever since. "It would extend our water access considerably," she said. "It would," he said. "And the price? Brennan's asking 3,000. I think he'd take 2,500. Do you have the figures?" she said. He got up and went to his desk and came back with a folded paper, which she took and read in the firelight. And they were there for another hour going through the numbers the way they had gone through documents a decade ago, across the table from each other, their minds running on parallel tracks that kept arriving at the same conclusions by different routes, which was still, after everything, one of her favorite ways to spend an evening. They bought the Brennan acreage in March of 1892, and the Broken Spur became the largest ranch in that part of the territory, which pleased Eva less for the status of it than for the operational soundness it represented. Good water, good grass, room to grow. She was 40 years old. The library had 2,000 books. The school had 4 rooms and 3 teachers. Clara Holt Fowler's daughters had both graduated to the upper classes with distinction. Harlan Sawyer, 9 years old, had declared himself committed to surveying and had begun learning to read topographic maps, assisted by his father, who still had every plat map the territory had ever produced in a cabinet beside his desk. Margaret Ruth Sawyer, 7, had produced a careful, handwritten catalog of every species of insect she had observed on the Broken Spur property, which she presented to Eva one morning as a formal document, with a seriousness that required a formal response, and Eva had accepted it with due solemnity and put it in the library's natural history section. In the evenings, sometimes, Eva would take out the letter she had written at 2 in the morning in 1882, which she had retrieved from Milton's desk within the first week of their marriage, and which she kept in the locked drawer at the bottom of her writing cabinet. She did not read it often. She read it perhaps once a year, in the quiet of the study, and she read it not with embarrassment but with a kind of clear-eyed recognition of the woman who had written it, the woman who had been so certain that feeling something was irrelevant. It was the most honest thing she had ever written. She was glad it had reached its destination. There was an evening in the summer of 1892, a soft, warm evening in June when the territory was beautiful in the particular way it was sometimes beautiful, the colors enormous and the air carrying the smell of sage, when Eva and Milton rode together out to the east ridge of the Broken Spur, up through the juniper and pinyon, to the place where you could see the full spread of the ranch below, and beyond it the rooftops of Garrison Falls, and beyond those the flat pale line of the horizon. They sat their horses on the ridge and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Eva thought about her grandmother in a wagon, about her grandfather with his surveying instruments, about her father at the desk in the White House, keeping books that were being slowly corrupted beneath his hands, about the girl of 26 who had arrived with a carpetbag and a Boston education and a grief she had been carrying very precisely, determined to recover what had been taken. She thought about October of 1881 and Milton looking up from his book with those gray eyes. She thought about all the Thursdays. "I keep thinking," she said, "about what Pete Holloway said. About the Broken Spur being a waste if I left." "Not quite those words," Milton said. "Something involving the word waste," she said. "He said it would be a waste of someone exceptional," Milton said. I agreed with him. She looked at the town with her family's name on it, the library roof catching the last of the afternoon sun. "I stayed for the work," she said. "I want you to know that I know the difference. I stayed for the work and for you, both things equally real." "I know," he said. "I didn't stay because I had no other options," she said. "I know that too," he said. and there was something in his voice that was warm and certain and without any trace of insecurity, because he was, and had always been, a man who was secure enough to hear the truth and not need it softened. She turned her horse and rode back down the ridge, and he came beside her, and the territory spread around them in all its colors, and below them the town and the school and the library and the house at the broken spur where their children were being minded by Margaret Sawyer, who had fit into the household as though she had always been there, which perhaps was what it looked like when the right people found the right place. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. The school needed a new roof before winter. There was a land dispute one county over that Milton had been asked to consult on. There were 2 women in Garrison Falls who were in situations that required information Eva had and they needed, and she was going to have those conversations. There was a catalog that needed updating, a budget that needed reviewing, a letter to the territorial school board that needed writing. And there was dinner to be made and children to be read to, and the worn sofa by the fire, and the particular warmth of a man who had blocked a road once, because he believed in not letting important things disappear without being named. Eva Garrison Sawyer rode down from the ridge into the evening of the life she had chosen and built, and she was, with the specificity and groundedness of a woman who does not deal in abstractions, entirely and exactly happy. The stars came out over Garrison Falls one by one, the way they always did in that country, slowly at first and then all at once, filling the enormous sky from edge to edge until the darkness was crowded with light. And in the broken spur kitchen the lamp was burning and the children were arguing cheerfully about beetles and maps, and Milton was reading at his desk, and Eva was writing a letter, and outside the territorial night was wide and calm and full of the patient permanence of things that have been earned. The letter she was writing was not to a school in Denver. It was not an appeal to a legislature or a request for book donations. It was a letter to a woman in Santa Fe who had written to Eva asking how she had built the library and the school and asking whether such a thing might be possible in Santa Fe. Eva was writing the letter the way she wrote every letter, clearly and thoroughly and without condescension, telling the woman in Santa Fe everything she knew about how it was done. She finished it. She folded it. She addressed it. She sent it with the morning's outgoing mail. Then she went and stood in the doorway of the front room where Milton was reading and Harland had fallen asleep over his map book, and little Margaret Ruth was still awake, sitting under the table with a lamp and a book about beetles, and Eva looked at all of it with the same focused attention she had given the Aldrich ledgers in another time, except that what she was reading now was not fraud or loss or injustice, but simply her life, accumulated and present and real. Milton looked up. "Come sit down," he said. She came and sat down, and the fire was warm and the territory was vast and quiet beyond the walls, and in the morning there would be work, important work, the kind worth doing, and that was enough. That was, in fact, everything.